Welcome back, one and all basketball fans. Glad you guys are back on the pod to join me and my special guest this evening on Business Casual Basketball. This is episode 147. We're going to be discussing a couple of storylines that are going to be intertwined quite a bit here. They're going to kind of intersect because there's some teams that are kind of on both ends of the spectrum that we're going to cover in both segments. But it basically comes down to two things, team construction, roster construction, as it pertains to some of the top-heavy teams we see in the playoffs, the consequences of that, as opposed to the more of the balanced teams with a bunch of different guys that can contribute. And then, there's no shortage of news stories. I mean, we know what's been going on in the NBA over the past 24 to 48 hours, and we can, sit here for 3 hours and discuss everything that's been going on. But we're going to basically narrow it down to that concept as well as the news of Kawhi and CP3 being out for their respective teams. And basically what that means for those guys as they continue to chug along through the playoffs here. But my special guest for this evening is McCade Pearson. He's very talented. He has a lot of, experience as it pertains to math, analytics. That's kind of like what he's geared towards. Capologist. I like to believe that he's a man of many talents and many interests. So,
I don't know if there's many interests there. There might only be one interest, and that's basketball.
many talents, maybe a few interests. But, McCade is an avid supporter of the Utah Jazz. You can find him on Twitter kind of discussing that team and, basically what's been going on with them. And they're going to be a hot topic of our conversation today, which is why I wanted to bring him on to discuss them as far as some other teams in the playoffs. But McCade, thanks for joining me this evening, man. We were on a podcast not too long ago, so, definitely good to link up again and talk ball. But I'm glad you're here, and thanks for offering your time this evening.
It's always fun to get down and talk about some nitty-gritty things.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself. So before we get the conversation started, there are a few sponsors that I want to shout out for a promo here real quick. We have teespring.com /store/unwrapped is that link that's going to be at the bottom of your screen on the ticker. We have some products available for purchase, some apparel, some really cool products that me and some of the people on the podcast network, Unwrapped Sports, like to offer you guys if you want to support us. So you can check out that link down at the bottom if you want to support us through those products. Another way you can support us is by signing up for one of three, basically, tier levels of, being a supporter on patreon.com /unwrapped sports. So that's going to allow you guys to get the opportunity to interact with us on a deeper level, get entered into some really cool contests if you guys are into that, and some other benefits if you guys want to get started with us there on patreon.com. We love your support if you are willing and able to do so. Also, mybookie.ag has a code USN100 they have offered us for a 100% sign-up bonus. So if you guys are looking to get into betting, you want to put some money down on one of these teams left in the playoffs, or want to get into some of the other sports going on right now, be sure to use that code if you want to get your deposit doubled and really get started on the betting game, because there's no better time than now to kind of get in on that action. Lastly, rxhemp.com is a sponsor of ours. rxhemp-usn gives you 10% off your entire order if you guys want to get started with their recovery products and get yourself back on your feet if you are kind of suffering through some pain, as a lot of these guys are in the playoffs right now, going through some injuries of their own. So that's going to give you 10% off your order if you want to get some of their products and get involved in that, if you're really involved in athletics and things like that. So, McCade, man, our first topic here today is basically going to be the concept of top-heavy rosters versus balanced rosters. So basically, I've kind of split this category. There's like 3 to 4 teams per category that I've identified kind of off the top of my head. So basically, if we're looking at top-heavy teams, I think of teams like Brooklyn, the Lakers, the Mavericks, and the Sixers. And then the opposite end of the spectrum are going to be teams like the Jazz, the Suns, the Hawks. They're not as reliant on one player to generate offense and really get them into a rhythm. And basically what kind of brought me to this idea that I wanted to discuss this evening is the ripple effects that we've seen from each type of team. We've seen top-heavy teams have injuries to one of their big guys. Joel Embiid for the Sixers, LeBron and AD for the Lakers, James Harden and Kyrie for the Nets. It's kind of like a recurring theme. We've seen how susceptible those teams can be if one of their main guys are out. And then conversely, for the balanced teams, you look at how the Jazz have performed. I mean, last night it was definitely, just they were a victim of PG's brilliance. But overall, I think their performance in the playoffs has been pretty good, and especially Phoenix, seeing as they have so many guys that can contribute on a high level. So I really wanted to start this conversation with you by asking this simple question, like, do you feel like this year is going to be a departure from what we've seen in past years as it pertains to like one of these balanced teams winning a championship. Maybe the Jazz or Phoenix can take home the title. In the past few years, we've seen the Warriors, we've seen the Cavaliers, we've seen these loaded teams win it. Do you feel like this is maybe the start of a new era, a new type of team winning, roster construction, or is this more of like a one-off because those teams that are top heavy have had so many injuries to their main guys?
I think first thing. Oh, can you hear me?
Yep.
Sweet. So I think the first thing is the transition we've seen lately from super teams and these top heavy teams as they've gone from these big threes, these Dwayne Wade, Chris Bosh, and LeBron James to a lot of big twos. And Brooklyn's kind of was able to get James Harden there to be a third player, obviously. But for the most part, these top heavy teams are trying to keep it at two so they can go a little bit more balanced. And on the flip side of that, though, the balanced teams are still trying to get more top end talent. Where you are having, one of the few big threes in the league is, the only team to have 3 All-Stars this year in the Western Conference is the Jazz with Conley, Mitchell, and Gobert. And so by balancing it out a little bit more, you might actually be able to get a third or even a fourth level All-Star on a team. And so I think you're seeing the two extremes kind of merge a little bit together because any extreme is always just so fragile. And you're seeing that with the Jazz right now. When you try and go super balanced, if you're not balanced 1 to 15, if you're only balanced 1 to 8 or 9, an injury can kill you. Whereas, the Lakers last year, for example, who won the title, were able to withstand some more, our 4th player's hurt, our 6th player's hurt, our 7th player's hurt because of that top end talent. Just the probability of one of your important players getting hurt is obviously a lot better when you have 2 of them instead of 6 of them.
Yeah, true that. I like how you kind of you put that. I mean, basically, we're seeing the 2 extremes here, but even though the balanced teams don't have quite the same level of maybe tier 1 players, they're still trying to achieve that, through free agency. If somebody becomes available, of course, they're going to go out and pursue a player like that. Of course, their circumstances might not allow them to do so. But I think it's really important to remember in these playoffs that even if you are a balanced team, you're still susceptible to a drop off. And we're going to get into that as it pertains to CP3 being out for the Suns. But yeah, in any case, I think the Phoenix and the Jazz are really good case studies for this point. You look at the Jazz specifically, being without Conley, Mitchell has been not quite himself. We saw that last night. His performance is definitely subpar compared to prior playoff performances. And it's really interesting to see how that kind of changes their dynamic. I think you can speak to this for Utah. I mean, their approach doesn't really change. I think they became more dependent on Mitchell once Conley was lost. But they still rely on a generally like you want to get guys involved. Bogdanovich was absolutely insane that first half of last night's game. He's still very involved. In guys like that, Joe Ingles still commands a lot of attention. He drives a lot of the offense through his playmaking. But they still have a general kind of theme when it comes to how they want to operate their offense, and that doesn't really change. They're not just going to all of a sudden post up Gobert because they have a guy down. They're going to stick to him running pick and rolls and things like that. And, the Hawks as well, you could throw them into this mix. They've been a little bit banged up. Trae Young has been a little bit hurt, but they just keep chugging along. So it's pretty cool to see, how teams, which teams are so dependent on one play style and other teams are willing to adapt a little bit more and change up just depending on the circumstances.
And that's a very interesting thing because I do think you have to be able to play in a lot of different ways to win in the playoffs because 7-game series are just 7 games. You can't do the same thing 7 times and expect to, you look at this Jazz Clippers series, obviously the series I'm most invested in, you could say. But we got through 3 games and I was looking at it and I was like, none of these 3 games mean anything. All 3 of these games were just so fluky and different that we can't really take away anything from these 3 games. And projected going forward. And even the last 2 games have been pretty similar. I think game 5 was pretty reasonable. You could kind of see that happening again. But by that point, Kawhi's out and that whole mess. And so in the playoffs where you play 7 different games, literally, you have to be able to do different things. But at the same time, if you don't have what got you there, if you don't have a base identity, it's really hard because then you don't necessarily know exactly which play style you want to. You're just kind of going out there and figuring it out as you go. And you don't have that kind of time in the NBA.
Yeah, just ask the Milwaukee Bucks if you have time to stick to a game plan and not really adapt, because I think they're another team I haven't really mentioned yet. I haven't really put them in a category. I want to lean more towards the top heavy, especially after acquiring
the Drew trade.
Holiday. Yeah. That's definitely the one that kind of sways me more in that direction, because you look at the rest of the roster. I mean, a case study, a great example of this, I think was I want to get the game right. I want to say it was a game 4 that Giannis and Middleton had like all their points in like the first quarter. I think they scored like all 30, whatever it was. You look at something like that, a situation like that, it's like, well, yeah, obviously they're going to be pretty reliant on 2 or 3 guys to generate offense. But I think their problem is they're not willing to really adapt that much. I mean, Giannis still has the same just drive and attack mentality. Not many other counters to what the defense offers him, what they provide him. Chris Middleton is doing kind of the same thing he's always been doing. They're still going ISO. They're falling into a trap. So I don't think they've been as adaptable. And we've seen that I think this is like the 3rd postseason in a row. They kind of run into that wall. And that's why I'm kind of lower on their odds of winning. Even though the talent is there, and they've done a great job of acquiring guys that can, realistically give them a shot. But the process isn't quite there for them. I don't think they have quite what it takes from an adaptability perspective. It just hasn't been present so far.
I do think, kind of going off on another tangent, one of the interesting things a team can do that we've seen, it doesn't necessarily work super well in terms of winning a championship, but you can kind of front load a contract, same idea with your team and all their contracts, like what we saw with the Blazers over the last 5 years, and kind of what we're going to see with the Jazz moving forward is where you try and be this balanced team. But you try so hard, and you can even put Milwaukee in this category, where you try so hard to be a balanced team that as time goes on and assets swing around and you have bad draft picks, and you give up all these picks and just life moves on, you kind of drift away into being a top-heavy team without necessarily getting better top-heavy players. As I said, we saw this with Dame and CJ over the last 5 years. You look at the Jazz with all their age, and they have a ton of age around their team. You're going to see that with Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert, where the surrounding cast – you can try and be a balanced team early, but you can drift away to being a top-heavy team without that tier 1 talent you mentioned earlier. And that's what I think these balanced teams have to be really careful about. And as I said, you're kind of seeing that with Milwaukee right now, where they tried the balance thing for a while. Brook Lopez was playing really well. Eric Bledsoe was a great player for him and all these things. And then it just wasn't working. So they tried to condense it more and more and more into just top-end talent. And it hasn't worked for him quite yet, but it's at least something different. But it's just a dangerous game to play long term.
It is, because I think the mistake some of us can make when we're evaluating these rosters, we fall into a trap of thinking like, oh, they're top heavy because they have, let's say, like a Brooklyn type of roster, like they have 2 or 3 top 10 players, but it's not necessarily that simple. We have to think about who commands the most of the offense for that team. And Portland's a great example with Dame and CJ and maybe like Nurkic or something like that. They're definitely a top heavy team, but they don't have that top end talent of the Lakers or, the Bucks or something like that. Their 2 best players, Dame and CJ, they definitely have a lot to offer on offense, but neither of those guys are particularly effective on defense. They have overlapping skill sets. And I think that's part of why they've suffered so much in the playoffs, because those 2 guys kind of play a similar game. And then when an opponent comes in and they're able to kind of disrupt one's game, the other is kind of susceptible to the same type of shortcomings, the same type of flaws. So, that's really a great point. And it kind of brings me to another question I've been thinking about. For a team like Milwaukee, for instance, they have Chris Middleton as arguably the second best player. We can go back and forth. Is it Middleton? Is it Holiday? But if you have a guy at that level, let's say it's a tier 2 or a tier 3 type player as your second best player, I'm not sure that a guy like that can get you over the hump if he is your second option. Now, this is, it's been floating around a lot because people have different opinions on where Middleton falls in the hierarchy of the NBA. Is he top 25? Is he top 30? Like, whatever that is. But it's just interesting to look at, who is that next man up? Because the top player there, I can't remember if it was you or somebody mentioned this recently. I heard this, but somebody said like your top player is going to show up 90, 98, 99% of the time. That's not going to change. But that second guy, historically they may be a little more susceptible to drop-offs. Middleton's no exception. We've seen that in the past. But do you have like a certain expectation when it comes to who that second guy is? If you really want to win a championship, is Middleton in high enough class, or do you need something a little bit more when it comes to that top end talent?
I think Middleton's a high enough class, just at the very base level. I think there are permutations of teams out there where you can win a title with Middleton being your second best player. I'd even say the Bucks are probably one of those, but on the lower end of that. But kind of going back to the whole balance thing is it kind of goes, if blank is your second best player, then you need to be a balanced team, or you need to be a top heavy team or whatnot, And so the answer is different for an Anthony Davis and a Chris Middleton. And so with Chris Middleton, he's a fine number 2 option. You prefer to have him as a high end 3 option instead of a low end 2 option. But if he's going to be your number 2, it's just hard when you're, 5th, 6th, 7th highest paid players are PJ Tucker, Pat Connaughton, Bobby Portis, who are great players, and they went out and got PJ Tucker and all that fun stuff. But, they sometimes are kind of missing that 5th piece, especially with the injuries they have. And you're seeing that a lot around the league, where they get down to this 5th or 6th piece, and the era of switching defenses in the playoffs like that, your 5th best player on the court matters a lot more than it did maybe 20, 30 years ago.
True that. And you remind me of an article. I believe I sent this to you when we were talking about setting up this podcast. It was basically the value of secondary creators. And I thought this was a really cool piece by Ryan Mitchell on Fansided. And, basically he said that, we're seeing these guys, the value they bring, I think, be a little bit more pronounced in these playoffs. I think he mentioned guys like Bogdanovich, what he offers to that team. I mean, I would even say that Reggie Jackson is filling that role for the Clippers right now, with Kawhi being out. These guys are getting a lot more shine, because they're asked to step into a void that maybe a big-time player has left behind. And I love that they're getting that type of attention, because I think when we get to the playoffs, all the stories are about the stars. But these guys that may be your 3rd or 4th option on offense, or let's say for the Jazz, let's say it's Jordan Clarkson, someone like that, a 6-man of the year type guy. Like, they're as vital as anybody on that roster, because if they're not there to maybe pick up the slack, if Donovan Mitchell is sluggish or Trae Young is sluggish, then you're still at a pretty big disadvantage, because every little advantage helps in the playoffs, and weaknesses are exposed. And your depth is exposed. As you mentioned, having 9, 10 deep is definitely an advantage. But I definitely wanted to highlight those guys, because they mean a lot for their teams, and they've changed the trajectory of some of these series we've watched so far.
Yeah, creating is probably the number one important thing in the NBA right now. That's what you need from an offensive player, whether it's a Kevin Durant who just creates his own shots and doesn't care if someone's in his face, or whether it's the Trae Youngs of the world who are going to create for their teammates. And then you get into the Lucas and Hardens that kind of do both. And, you need people who can create an offense. That's the whole purpose of basketball, is to make sure you create good offense and make sure your opponent doesn't create good offense. And with the switching defense thing, we've seen a lot more. And just with some of the styles of play we're seeing, the importance of a secondary creator is massive. It's kind of, and it can be a little overdone. The Jazz have 4 secondary creators right now, but they don't have a primary creator, and they're struggling because of it. But theoretically, if the Jazz are healthy, that's what made them the number 1 seed. Is Mike Conley would break you down, Donovan would break you down, and then all of a sudden you're swinging the ball around left and right, and you have guys like Joe Ingles and Jordan Clarkson who can create their own shots or create for others. Even when you get down to the lower levels of a guy like Bojan Bogdanovic or Royce O'Neal, where they're at least smart enough to catch the ball in the corner on the wing, drive to the rim, and make something happen from there. At least just make the next obvious step. And so that's kind of what the Jazz really, really lead into. And that's why it's both worked and not worked at the levels it has, is because secondary creation around Donovan Mitchell was such an issue in the series against Houston, both in 2018 and 2019.
Yeah, those are great points, McCade. And you basically, just, we gotta give these guys their due. We really can't understate the importance of these guys. And I think another trap we fall into is the specialist of the NBA. So, I think of like 3-and-D guys. This is a type of player that was mentioned in that article that I referenced earlier from Fansided. He mentioned that we praise the 3-and-D guys. We praise PJ Tucker. We praise Bryn Forbes for what they bring to a team. And they're very valuable, of course. But the flip side is these are players that need someone else to set them up. And that point brings me back to Dallas, and they have a lot of issues right now. And Luka is great. He's fantastic. But
they might have more issues by the time we're done recording this podcast at the pace they're going.
I know, right? It's just like every hour something else pops up, and it's like, wow. I mean, how many issues does this team have to deal with? But in the playoffs specifically, their issue was secondary creation, and basically their only option for that was Tim Hardaway Jr. And as we know, he does this a little bit. He's 4 for 6 from 3 one game. Next game he's 1 for 7. You're not quite sure how much offensive production you're going to get from him. And then when that wasn't there, Luka was on an island. There were some clips in that article that showed Luka dribbling the ball for like 20 seconds and not getting a good shot, not getting a good offensive possession. And that's really just a shame when you're looking at how good that team can be if Porzingis can provide that in some way. Basically, he's just stretch 4, stretch 5. He doesn't offer too much more than that. But I think we get a little bit obsessed with guys that can shoot 45% from 3. But if you can't create for yourself, you're a Duncan Robinson, but you don't have the self-creation to be able to get those clean shots. I think you have limitations in the playoffs when you don't have those type of secondary creators that can get you those looks, because those guys are a little bit more dependent on other people to set them up. So that's the other part of the equation I wanted to highlight. Specialists have their place, but if they're forced into too big of a role, I think they get exposed, and that's kudos to the Clippers. I think they exposed that flaw for the Mavericks, and that's why they're at home.
More of a primary creator there. But no, it is interesting seeing how much we've swapped around. I mean, we are 4 years removed from everybody freaking out about Chris Paul and James Harden playing together, or even James Harden and Kyrie Irving playing together 6 months ago. And yet, when you have those extra creators, if you can get 2 primary creators to work together as one just a secondary creator, it just opens up your offense so much. Because we can sit here and talk basketball. We can talk about the 50s, the 70s, the 90s today, whenever you want to talk about. And the goal is always move the ball around, get the ball to the rim, hit layups. The three-point era hasn't changed that. Nothing will ever change that. Everybody wants dunks, and dunks are great, and they're 2 guaranteed points, basically. And the way to do that is with good creation and with good secondary creation and then good tertiary creation and so on and so forth. And that just has such a value we've seen recently over the past 3-4 years develop, especially when it was a concern. We're not that far removed from the Darren Williams, Steve Nash, Chris Paul days where everyone had their point guard. And before that, even with the John Stockton, Isaiah Thomas generation, that you had your point guard and that was okay. And that worked a lot of times with the post and all that fun stuff. But now just a secondary creation of somebody else to make a decision after you is so vital and so important.
That is super important. And a big reason for that is I think positions are just kind of going by the wayside a little bit. And people are the positions are ambiguous and roles are a little bit more ambiguous than they were before. So, people aren't just streamlined to one thing. It's like, okay, you bring the ball up and you set up the offense. Now it's like you set up the offense, but you're creating your own shot and you're doing this and that. So I think that also contributes a little bit more. And so far our discussions have really been revolving around these teams that have a lot of contributors and secondary creators, but we can't understate the importance of the big guns, the big guys. And a couple of those guys have gone down recently. The first one we're going to discuss here today is Kawhi, unfortunately. Some type of ACL injury, that's what we've heard so far from the Clippers side. And that's really unfortunate. He was coming into his own. I mean, he was having a fantastic playoff run, averaging more than 30 points and just absolutely demoralizing, these teams that have come in contact with him so far. But since he's not going to be available, Paul George, a.k.a. Playoff P, has arrived on the scene, and he's put his imprint on the series with the Jazz, being up 3-2 as of today. And there was 2 aspects of his play I wanted to evaluate. The first is his mindset. He came into this game basically saying that he knew he had to revert back to a prior state. My good friend Shane Young over at Forbes Sports, had some quotes from the post-game conference, and PG basically said, I've been in a position before where I had to be the guy in Indiana. And, he said, I had to dig into a place that I've been before. And that really stood out to me, just showing that he's capable of kind of digging back into that primary number 1 option guy that he was before. And basically that bared out in the numbers. He had 37, 16, and 5 last night. Fantastic play against the Jazz. Royce O'Neal, shout out to Royce O'Neal, man. He did everything he could, but sometimes greatness just wins out, man. Better O beats better D every time, But he had a fantastic game, and so far in the playoffs, I mean, he's been averaging 26, 9 and 5, 46, 36, 90 shooting splits. So fantastic performance, and I mean, the Jazz definitely read the scouting report. They knew what he wanted to get to, but he was fantastic. So we got to give him props. He's been through a lot, but today he deserves some credit.
He deserves all the credit in the world. And first, I just want to say thoughts out and prayers out to Kawhi Leonard. That sucks. That sucks even as a Jazz fan. That sucks for Clippers fans. That sucks for all NBA fans. It's no fun for anyone. And it is what it is, and you just kind of have to show your shoulders and move on, and there's nothing you can do about it, but that sucks, and I feel bad for them. But, yeah, on to Paul George. He was fantastic. He's kind of been the barometer of this series. He was dreadful in games 1 and 2, and the Jazz basically stole wins. They probably shouldn't have won game 1 or game 2, but they did. And then Paul George has been lights out the last 3 games, and that's how they rallied back from 2-0 to go up 3-2. And he's just been lights out. He was great yesterday. As you mentioned, he made the comment about his Indiana days and kind of going back to that, and he did that. And that takes a lot to go out and do that, especially when you don't have a Kawhi Leonard or, to a lesser extent, a Russell Westbrook right there next to you. You're the sole focus. And that put extra pressure on him, and he totally stepped up to the moment. I think the world these days is a little insane and crazy and fast-paced with how much we wait on playoff success and winning championships and all that fun stuff, because all that stuff's important. But Paul George has been a pretty good playoff player his entire career. He's had some rough games and some rough moments, and it's fair to criticize those. But, I said before Game 5 yesterday, one of Rudy Gobert and Paul George is going to win this series, and one of them is going to lose it. And that doesn't mean the one that lost it's awful and the one that, wins it is all of a sudden this great player. The reason we love basketball, especially this stage of the year, is it's fun watching the best players in the world go at it and play to win. And one of them's going to win and one of them's going to lose, or a couple of them with, we just talked about top heavy teams and whatnot. And Paul George has done everything he's needed to do the last 3 games to make sure his team comes out on top. And we'll see if he can do it one more time or not. But last night was a big statement from, do I dare say playoff P? Will that get me fired by Jazz fans?
I think it's fair to say. I think he's kind of been widely anointed as that type of guy. So I think that's fair, no matter what fan base you're a part of. But yeah, honestly, he came to play, and I'm really impressed. And I will sit here and I'll offer an apology. I've been on him for the past couple of years, and after his meltdown back in 2018 against the same team. With OKC, that was just, that was rough to see.
That was not rough to see.
Not from your perspective. Definitely not from your perspective.
No, you're good. No. But he had definitely struggled. He had, I think it was only 5 points in game 6. He was something 2 for 15 shooting. He was rough that series. And so it's fun. He made a comment about Jazz fans, because I'm not sure if you can hear the crowd on TV as well as we can in person. But Jazz fans are nuts. And we are loud and we are relentless. And everyone's chanting overrated or push off P or whatever it may be that day that we decide to annoy Paul George with. And you can tell it gets to him a little bit, but he made a comment after the game last night about how much he loves it and how much he respects it because we hate him for the right reasons, is I think his exact quote. And so you love to see the trials and struggles and the overcomings and where he is now, and you give him all the credit in the world last night.
I love that growth, and that is a quote that I also kind of took a screenshot of, and I highlighted that one. Because, it's really cool to see how he respects this fan base and, how you guys are so passionate about your team. And, he said, y'all are passionate, community passionate state. He said the Utah crowd is up there with the best of them. It's a pleasure to play in front of these fans. I love to see that. I love how he kind of gives you guys the credit for making that atmosphere as tough as possible to play in. But at the same time, he was unfazed this time. No one can get in his head. No one threw him off balance. Mentally, he was super strong. He came in and did what he needed to do, and that speaks volumes. But, there's also a player on this roster I wanted to give credit to, and he's had some up and down past few years. Reggie frickin' Jackson, man.
Oh, man.
I didn't expect that.
He's as good as Jamal Murray and John Morant from my point of view.
Yeah, I mean, in this series, you're pretty much on point. Last night, 22 points, 8 for 15 from the field. I think I've seen some film studies over the past, 12 hours or so, and they've basically been highlighting Reggie Jackson's ability as a floor spacer. And I think there was a clip. I think it was Paul George driving the lane, and it showed within that lane where the square is, where the restricted area is, there was no one in that area, just driving straight down the middle of the floor to provide help, because they're playing that small lineup with Batum at the 5, basically, Marcus Morris, Reggie Jackson. And for Utah, I mean, you guys really have to be on point about staying home at the shooters, because Reggie's been killing it as a catch and shoot threat. Marcus Morris, I mean, 25 points last night, 10 of 16 shooting, hitting his 3-pointers. You know Paul George is going to do that. So it really just kind of opens things up for this roster. And, you know, we can get into Gobert, and he's been taking a lot of criticism over the past few hours here, with people are saying he's the problem, and, you know, Gobert's the reason guys lost and stuff like that. I think that's a little unfair, but I think he is at a disadvantage when it comes to the type of lineups that the Clippers are putting on the floor. So, I mean, from across the roster, I think a lot of people stepped up, not even just Paul George, Reggie and Marcus. I mean, kudos to them. They're taking full advantage of this scheme that puts people in kind of disadvantaged positions, and they're capitalizing.
No, they have been awesome. And, you know, Jazz fans got way ahead of themselves before this series and said, well, at least the one thing we for sure have is a coaching advantage with Quinn Snyder over Ty Lue. And Ty Lue has his issues, but if there's one thing that guy can do, it's he can figure out how to play defense in the playoffs, and that is worth a ton. That's what he did to the Warriors back in the day with Cleveland. That's what he's doing with the Jazz this series, is he'll try different things. And, you know, that's what we're sitting here criticizing Bud and Quinn Snyder a lot over, is Ty Lue, you know, threw out 10, 12 guys in the first 2 games. DeMarcus Cousins got minutes. Some other, you know, Luke Kennard was in and out of the rotation. Patrick Beverley went from 2 DNP CDs against Dallas to, you know, playing big minutes. Rajon Rondo's in and out. He just tries different things, and he figures out, hey, this is how we can stop that team. And it's been great on both sides of the ball for the Clippers. And, I mean, we don't have to get too much into the Gobert defending outside thing, because Gobert is an elite defender on the perimeter. He shuts down people on the perimeter all the time. There's a billion clips of that if people go look for him and say just watch whatever video pops up on their Twitter feed. On the other side of that coin, though, is it does take him out of where he's elite. He's an elite rim protector, and so of course it makes sense, and of course it's obvious that another team wants to take him away from the rim. And the Clippers have done that pretty darn well. And then, you know, the second layer to that is, okay, if he comes over to help, either you hit the shooter, Terrence Mann and Nick Batum for the most part, and you just have to live with that as a Jazz fan. So it's not that, you know, Nick Batum's taking Rudy Gobert off the dribble every single time, but it's making him run back and forth from the rim to the corner 3 to the rim to the corner 3 all day. And then it's killed the rebounding as well. You know, Gobert led the league in defensive rebounds, and rightfully so. He's an elite rebounder. But if he's guarding this guy in the 3-pointer, I mean, I can't tell you how many times this year I've seen Gobert be right up in a guy's face, contest a 3-point shot. The guy takes an awful shot that breaks off the backboard and clanks off the rim, and they get an offensive rebound because Gobert's not there. Gobert's out forcing the miss. But you don't play defense to force a miss. You play defense to get the ball back. And so that's been an issue. Royce O'Neal helps with that a little bit at 6'4", but Boyan's not good enough at that. Donovan's okay. Conley's okay, but both Donovan and Conley are under 6'3", and they're usually out on the perimeter. And so it's a great strategy by the Clippers. I don't think it's any knock on Gobert. Gobert's doing a bad job on it. It's just
agreed.
The Jazz put so much pressure on their perimeter defenders to step up in that situation, and they don't have the perimeter defenders to do that.
Exactly. That's kind of the conundrum you're dealing with. And I think with Gobert, it's not so much as like taking it from one area where he's this good and then all of a sudden he becomes garbage. It's just that, like, when you're playing teams that are this good and players that are this good, you basically have to play the percentages. So, like, what are your odds of getting an advantage outside as opposed to inside? I think odds are definitely better that you can gain a little bit more of an edge out there as opposed to challenging him at the rim because of how elite he is in there, as you mentioned. So that's what basically it comes down to. But if we're really going to project this forward, we're going to look at maybe how sustainable these performances are. You know, I'm trying to figure out if, you know, Game 6 is it. Is there going to be a Game 7? Does Utah have a chance? You know, the Clippers, I think that as far as winning a championship, I don't particularly love their chances, but I think they could definitely close out this series at least without Kawhi because they still have a guy named PG that's one of the elites, and they've been getting a lot of contributions from their supporting cast, who we've highlighted so much in this podcast already. So, from your perspective, I mean, is there more that Utah can do? Do they have other options to try to gain 2 more wins here? Or is
get
it
Mike Conley back healthy? That would be a good one.
That would help
No, and going back to our initial conversation of, you know, top heavy versus kind of balanced, this is one of the dangers with going balanced is you really have to be balanced. And the Jazz kind of only went halfway with that. If you want to be balanced, you have to go all the way in and you have to like really commit 1 through 15. And the Jazz, have 3 or 4 rookies on their team, 3 or 4 second-year players on the team. They traded for Matt Thomas at the trade deadline instead of, trading for Aaron Gordon like Denver did. And so it's hard to be balanced if you're not going to really commit to 12, 13 deep. And that's, I think, why the Clippers are a lot of people's title favorites, if healthy, without the Kawhi news injuries, because you look what they have with their guard lineup next to their big two is, Rajon Rondo can come out and be that secondary creator like we talked about. Luke Kennard can come out and be a shooter. Reggie Jackson can come out and be a shooter and kind of a secondary creator, but in a different way than Rondo. And so they have these different players that they can utilize, which kind of makes the Clippers one of the few very balanced teams with the top end talent. And that's why everyone thought they were going to win the championship. And so with the Jazz, it's, they don't have that 8th or 9th guy that can step up. I love George Niang. He's not great in this series. Favors is a big disappointment, obviously. And so you get down to, okay, now your balanced team is 6 guys, and you just got to hope they're good enough. And they very well could be. The Jazz could very well go out and win tomorrow. I think they're 2-point favorites in Vegas, so they have a very legit and decent chance. But it's just the cards are not in their favor if they're going to keep playing like this. The other thing is the Jazz have known for 2 years now that their perimeter defense is not good. They went to Rudy Gobert a couple years ago and said, hey, we know you're one of the best defensive players of all time. How good do you think you really are? And of course, Rudy's like, oh, I'm fantastic. I'm one of the top 3 or 4 defenders of all time. And he's not wrong, but they said, okay, well, do you care if we go all offense? And he kind of said yes. He kind of just rolled with it. But when you have Boyan and Joe and Donovan and Mike in front of you, then it's Rudy Gobert cleans up a lot of mistakes. And that's why everyone talks about the Jazz issues being backup center, but it's not really backup center. It's just Derek Favors isn't Rudy Gobert. Right. If Rudy Gobert solves the problems, it's not Derek Favors is the problem. So if the Jazz don't play defense, this series is over. We saw Jamal Murray tear us apart in the bubble last year. We saw John Morant tear us apart for 5 games. In a healthy world, it's Donovan that needs to step up. If we drafted him to be a 3-and-D guy, and he has been a lot more than a 3 guy on offense and a lot less than a D guy on defense. Oh, yeah. And so it's, he's right there with the Bradley Beals and Devin Booker and Trae Youngs of the world in terms of some of his advanced defensive numbers. And so in an ideal world, in a healthy world, if his ankle's okay, it's Donovan that needs to step up and say, hey, I can at least shut down Reggie Jackson. Royce O'Neal, Joe Ingles, go over and do your thing with Paul George, make it tough for him, but I can at least make sure Reggie Jackson doesn't score 20 points on us. But the Jazz just haven't got that, and it's been, 5 straight playoff series now, going back to when Harden beat us in 5 games back-to-back years.
Yeah, it's really tough to see kind of how that's come to play, and I really think it's just kind of too much to ask of Donovan right now when he's already trying to shoulder so much of the load offensively, just trying to give it a jump start, basically. When guys like Bogdanovich maybe go through a little bit of a shooting slump. But, yeah, it's definitely a tough situation. But from the Clippers' perspective, I think they have a great shot at going to the next series. And, if they're going up against Phoenix, they're going to have their work cut out for them because, as we see with Phoenix, I mean, they have guys. They run deep. And
you want to talk about a real balanced team. They have guys everywhere. They have nailed everything. We got to figure out the Chris Paul situation, which absolutely is just awful, and no one knows what's going on there. But I would not count out the Clippers against the Suns, but the Suns are really, really good from 1 to 7, 1 to 8. And, the big difference is if you let me go on one more little rant about the whole balance versus top end thing, because you got my mind rolling. And just going all in on that is the Suns went out this year and they did little things to make sure they had that balanced team with necessary. They claimed Frank Kaminsky off waivers. They somehow got Torrey Craig in like a random trade. They're like, hey, we'll give you a couple $100,000 for Torrey Craig. And that's been a big deal. And meanwhile, the Jazz just didn't do anything. The Jazz signed Ersan Ilyasova, which was fine. As I mentioned, they traded a 2nd-round pick for Matt Thomas at the trade deadline. And so if you want to have those balanced teams, you got to make sure you have that 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th guy to step up in case someone gets hurt. And it's those little things like trading cash for, Torrey Craig that can really swing those things. And it's why the Suns are in the position they are and are favored to go to the finals as of this very minute.
Hey, you said it, man. It's the little things. It's the little moves that, you make in January that no one really thinks about. And it comes back to be such a blessing when it comes to preserving depth and that production when people are out. So here we are. We're looking at the Suns now and their situation. The circumstances are different. This isn't an injury. This is protocol. It's really crazy because I thought we were kind of past all that with the whole protocol thing. after that whole rash of that whole wave that was earlier in the season. I thought
right
we were
at the
good,
All-Star break.
Yeah, right.
The All-Star break was a good pause.
Yeah, it did. It did. I thought we were good, and I'm sure you've seen like when Shams comes out every week and he's like, "This is how many players out of like 200 tested have COVID."
Zero
this
out
week
of 500. 0 out of 500.
Yeah.
0 out of 500. 0 out of 300 as we get to the second round. That's just 1 out of
and
200.
Then one, and I'm just like, that one guy had to be freaking CP3. Like, I just like that hurt my soul, man. Because you're looking at what CP3 has gone through the past few years, and his quote at the end of that closeout game versus the Nuggets, saying like, "People counted me out. People said I was done. I'm still here. This is about the team." And awful. I think it really is awful, man. But his comment about the team really rings true now because he said it's not about me. It's not about me. It's about us. So now they're in a situation where he's not there. So the team as a whole has to compensate for him being out. And I think that they have a lot to look forward to in Cameron Payne, because basically in that first round, when Chris Paul wasn't 100%, his shoulder was still bothering him. They got a glimpse of what could be without Chris Paul, and that involved Cameron Payne being the best, by far the best version of himself in his career, going out there, being a great dribble drive threat, being a great shooter in multiple situations. And like you said, Torrey Craig is here to pick up some slack. They have a lot of depth. I mean, I'm sure Javon Carter can throw him in for some spot minutes. He'd be a good option. But I love how many weapons they have. I mean, if you have Devin Booker to come in, if you have a guy like that to come in and assume some of that responsibility, that's such an advantage for you. And there's an article on The Ringer I'd read this morning, basically saying like, Chris Paul, I mean, this isn't the end for the Suns. They have a lot to look forward to because Devin Booker can assume two roles. He can be a combo guard, because I'm sure you guys remember.
He averaged 7 assists the last 2 years. 7 assists last 2 years. Exactly. And some of the more advanced kind of under the radar numbers say he's a lot better than the 4.5 assists he's averaged this year. They just have guys everywhere that you trust.
They do, man. And I think why Devin Booker averaged that many assists is because if we think back to those years in Phoenix where they didn't have that lead creator, where they had like a subpar guy at the one, and then Devin Booker had to come in and be that primary creator because they were so depleted at that position. That's where he got all his reps as a ball handler and pick and roll and all that experience. And now I think that is to his benefit and the team's benefit, because he can kind of morph back into that role where his usage goes up. In this article, I mean, basically there's a chart between Booker's stats with and without Chris Paul. And basically net rating without Chris Paul is +8. Net rating with Chris Paul is +12. But the big difference comes in basically without Paul, his true shooting percentage goes up, his assist percentage goes up, and then his usage goes up from 27 to 32%. So he's actually more efficient without Chris Paul in the lineup this season, which it says a lot to him and what he can do when he is the primary guy. But since he's been in that role before, I think there won't be a huge drop off. And they have Bridges to be a guy off the dribble. They have Ayton still. They have pieces. I think they'll be okay. And I think they're still in a great position. If they're playing the Clippers without Kawhi, I think they still have a great shot at winning that series, especially if Chris Paul can come back for maybe the last half of that series. Yeah, exactly. I'm not concerned. I'm not overly concerned with their situation because of what we've seen from Booker and these guys in the past years, but also just that first rounder against the Lakers recently.
Yeah, no, they just have so many guys that are so good. I think if I was building an NBA team from scratch, kind of the two things you're looking for that go hand in hand is, one, you don't want any negative players. People want to talk about top-end talent and how important it is, and it is. You've seen how many titles LeBron and Steph Curry and Kevin Durant have all won over the last decade. Top-end talent's important. But having no negative players and then leading that to no negative minutes is how you win championships, because as you mentioned with the Suns, if they stagger Chris Paul and Devin Booker, that's 48 minutes of pressure right there on you. Yep. And that's kind of the difference between the Suns and Jazz, in my opinion, is the Jazz are great. Rudy Gobert, something like a +16 per 100 possessions this year. It's fantastic. And yet when he goes to the bench, it's a -3. And last year, I think it was like a +11 and then -7. And it doesn't matter. They've tried everything. They've tried Mike Conley with the bench. They've tried Donovan Mitchell with the bench. They've tried Mike Conley and Donovan Mitchell with the bench. They've tried just letting the bench be bad and not with Mike Conley. It doesn't matter who they do. they went out and they got rid of Tony Bradley and Ed Davis to try and get Derek Favors. It doesn't matter what they do. The non-Rudy Gobert minutes have just been so bad the last 2-3 years that you're asking Rudy to be a +8, +10 every single game just to get a win. And that's what the Suns don't have. The Suns, as you just mentioned with the Chris Paul and Devin Booker numbers, and injuries obviously hurt that, but the Suns are going to put pressure on you and they're going to try and extend a lead for 48 minutes a night and not let up. And that's really hard to beat. And that's really, really hard to beat 4 times out of 7.
Extremely difficult, man. They have so much to offer on both ends of the court. And that's a great point on roster construction. You can't have players that can be exploited because that's like the whole theme of the playoffs is if there is a weakness, the other team will capitalize on that. Unless you're Milwaukee and you're playing James Harden and he's playing a one lady and you just completely disregard that. But by and large, teams are going to focus on the weak point of the opposite team's roster. So if it's a guy that can't guard in the perimeter, if it's a guy that can't guard at the rim, if it's somebody that's a non-shooter, they're going to be schemed out pretty much every time. So that's
if they have another option. If they don't have another option, they're not schemed out. They're just left with it, and that's bad. For example, Derek Favors has 145 defensive rating. The Jazz have 145 defensive rating when Favors is on the court this series, and you don't have another option, so you just have to roll with it. So
you're just screwed. You're just like, what are we gonna do? Like, I didn't know
play him off the court. Oh, it's so bad. I think it's 146 right now. So, but no, exactly. They're gonna try and play it off the court if you have a weakness. And so you either need to make sure you don't have a weakness or have a backup plan if that weakness does start to get exploited.
Right. And that's the beauty of the Suns. They have multiple backup plans. So, I mean, if they were to lose, they lost Ayton a little bit for foul trouble. I mean, obviously, if you're going against the Lakers, you're definitely going to be at a disadvantage. But if you're bringing in Dario Saric, off the bench, that can still be, a plus on offense. Like, I definitely, like that as opposed to maybe like a Favors that, I don't know how much you're going to get from him on either end just looking at what he offers right now in his career. But it's just, it's a lot for the Suns. They've done a really good job with this roster construction. Shout out to James Jones. And then how fast it's come together just in 2 years. And, there's all these jokes on Twitter and somebody will post a screenshot of their old starting lineups. I can't think of like people at the top of my head, but it's just, you see these people that Devin Booker is starting next to, and it's just like, wow, like it really wasn't that bad like 3 years ago, not even that long ago. So doesn't take much. You got to be smart. You got to get guys, you got to get balance. You got to get some talent. You got to get some luck. And that's what's happened. I mean, Devin Booker wasn't a high lottery pick. He wasn't a guy that was touted as the superstar, but he's morphed into that. And sometimes the unexpected is what kind of gets you, off and running towards being a contender sometimes. So my last big question here, just before we wrap up, man, is basically just looking at Chris Paul and, when he comes back, is he going to need ramp up time? I'm sure that he's not going to be able to just walk on the court and be the same player, but maybe just speak on that a little bit. And I think you had something before that, and feel free to elaborate on that too.
I was just going to throw out there, talking about non-negative things. I think it's the same thing for front offices, just making non-negative moves. Just even one step forward every single time, like the Suns have done, has got them to where they gotten to the point where they could trade for Chris Paul comfortably. But yeah, going on the Chris Paul stuff, I think he'll be fine. So we'll see how long he's out. If we assume 10 days, then that will be game 4. He'll be able to play in game 5 if the Clippers win game 4, if the Jazz win tomorrow. But the Suns can easily steal a game or two. Just like the Jazz did at home against the Clippers. The Suns can easily steal a game or two in those first 4, and then you got to trust that team to close it out in a best of 3 to finish the series. So if I'm a Suns fan, I'm still ecstatic. I am loving life right now. I'm just enjoying it. And then just on a secondary level of that, it's fun to have a deep run in the playoffs. I know you're a Miami Heat fan, so you get that all the time, right?
I was there last year, man. It's so nice, man. Nice.
It's so fun to enjoy it. And even if you don't win the championship, just enjoy the ride while you can. And
absolutely,
if you lose in the finals, you know what? You gave your best shot. You come back next year, you see what happens. But it's fun in the moment. It's fun to win a playoff series, regardless of what round it's in. And so if you're a Suns fan, or just even me as a Jazz fan, you just enjoy it, even when it goes a little south, that, hey, you're still around and you're still fighting, and that's all you can ask for. And it's been a fun year, even if you aren't even if you're not a fraud because you're one of the 29 teams that didn't win a trophy.
Exactly, man. I mean, there's one trophy to go along every year. So naturally, if you're not a winner, you're going to be one of the losers. But it doesn't have to. You don't have to be a loser in every sense of the word. I mean, as you mentioned before, I mean, if you make it to the second round conference finals, there's something to be said for that. That's a lot of success that some teams. I mean, go to talk to some Kings fans if they're even still with us. I mean, golly, I mean, going through 15 years of non-playoff basketball, I think that it could be worse. It could be worse than losing in the finals or losing in the conference finals. And I really feel that as a Heat fan. I mean, just last year being in the finals, I talked to people in my circle of Heat Twitter, and we all. I don't know if everybody agreed, but I said that it was my favorite year of watching Heat basketball, even more than the Big Three era, because there were no expectations.
Yeah.
So everybody would just go out there and just play to their heart's content. Everybody was just having fun, and the storylines were great. It was all great vibes. Everybody was just kind of exceeding what people expected. So that's what made it fun. So I guess that's our message to everybody listening, that if your team is on the verge of getting swept or losing in 5 or 6, like, hey,
enjoy
it, because you never know. You could be back next year. You can get swept by the Bucks. So while you have it, just take advantage, because you never know what happens next year.
The Jazz were 30th in the NBA. They had the longest drought in the entire NBA of having home court advantage in a first-round playoff series, which is wild because you think of all the Darren Williams era, you think of all this era. They've made the playoffs like 9 or 10 times in the last 20 years, but they never finished as a top 4 seed. And so just even being a top 4 seed and going to a game 1, the only other game 1 I'd been to in my life was when we played the We Believe Warriors in the second round. And so just going to a game 1 was super fun, even if we don't win the championship, because I'm so used. I've been to 1,000 game 3s. I've never been to a game 1.
I didn't know that, man.
Just things like that are just super fun to enjoy. And the Jazz weren't expected to win the title before the year, and so if we go out in 6 to the Clippers, if you'd have told me that preseason, I would have loved it. So enjoy being the 1 seed, enjoy winning games, and just enjoy great playoff basketball, no matter what is going on around the fluff and stuff.
Exactly. I mean, you can nitpick, but it really takes a lot to just kind of take in the whole experience. So I speak to that 100%, man. Those are great points. But I think that's basically going to take us to the end of our conversation this evening. I thank everyone listening, watching this, for your time. Appreciate you tuning in. Always a great time with McCade. Knows this basketball, knows a lot, even more about Jazz basketball. So great time talking about roster construction and some of these injuries, but also the bright side of these injuries as to what these teams can accomplish in light of these injuries. So, McKay, before you go, man, where can the people find you on Twitter? And then kind of what anything maybe you got going on that you want to plug?
So you can find me on Twitter at McCadeP8, MCCADEP8. I just got a degree in statistics, so I'm always tweeting out random stats and graphs and all that nerdy stuff.
Congrats, man.
I do. Thank you. I do like the capology stuff. So if anybody has any cap questions for their favorite team, I'm more than willing to answer questions or give opinions there. I have a Jazz podcast. If anyone's really dying to listen to a Jazz podcast, tweet at me and I'll get you the links and all that fun stuff.
Sweet. So any Jazz fans out there, that's your guide right there. Hit him up if you're looking for that coverage. But thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. BC Basketball 2 is our handle on Twitter and Instagram if you want to get involved with what we have to offer. And the bcbasketball.com is the link for our website if you want to check out some of our resources, like a free agent list that's going to be updated here pretty soon, and then blog posts that will be going up here pretty soon, some new entries on that. So everybody, enjoy these playoffs. Enjoy your team if they're still in it for the duration of these playoffs. Have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you on the next installment of the Business Casual Basketball Podcast. So take care, everybody, and we'll see you again soon.